I had been a park ranger at Yellowstone National Park for more than 30 years, but the events of May 18th, 2016 left me with an unexplained story that keeps coming back to haunt me. The sky was as clear as you can get, and the temperature hovered around 65 degrees, making it an ideal day for enjoying the vast expanses of nature that Yellowstone is known to offer. My fascination with nature began as a child growing up in the heart of Montana. My parents were both passionate about the outdoors, and they even instilled the same love in me from a very early age. I remember spending countless hours exploring the forests and mountains surrounding our home, often returning covered in dirt and pine needles, but with a huge grin on my face. Now, as I grew older, my love for the outdoors matured alongside me. During high school and college, I would volunteer at local parks, leading nature tours and helping maintain trails. My summertime were spent working as a seasonal ranger in different national parks all across the United States. It became clear to me that a career dedicated to sharing the beauty of our natural world was my true calling. Now, after earning my degree in environmental science, I was fortunate enough to be offered a full-time position as a ranger in Yellowstone National Park. So for more than 3 decades, I've had the honor of calling this amazing place my workplace. Now, throughout my years at Yellowstone, I've encountered countless wild creatures and experienced some truly amazing sights, from the spouting geysers and steaming hot springs to even the roaming herds of bison and elk. But none of which could have prepared me for what had happened. It all started when I received a call from one of our visitors saying they saw something strange near Old Faithful. Now, normally, these calls are about an injured or trapped animal, so I didn't think too much about it as I grabbed my gear and set out in the park service vehicle to assist. As I approached Old Faithful, one of Yellowstone's most famous geysers, I spotted a small gathering of visitors pointing towards a wooded area just off the boardwalk. Slowing down, I could see that something had captured their attention, but couldn't quite make out what they were looking at. Stepping out of the vehicle, I approached the group and asked them what they had seen. Well, there was a man with a camera in hand and told me that he saw a tall, dark figure standing silently among the trees before it disappeared out of sight. Now, from his description, I immediately thought it could be a bear or moose, both of which are common sights in the park. Asking everybody to step back for their safety, I began making my way towards the location where the creature was last seen. As I stepped onto the soft carpet of pine needles, I felt a sudden uneasiness wash over me. The dense foliage muffled sounds and cast shadows that played tricks on my eyes as I moved forward. I checked for prints, fur, or broken branches, but found no evidence that an animal was recently present. As I continued, the hair at the back of my neck stood up, and goosebumps covered my arms, despite the warm temperature. Sensing something nearby, I stopped in my tracks and did a quick 360-degree scan of my surroundings. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is when I saw it. Just as the visitors described, there in front of me stood a tall figure about 50 yards away, partially concealed by a thick grove of trees. It had to be at least 7 or 8 feet tall, dark hair covering most of its body, and as I stared in disbelief, the creature remained completely motionless, watching me intently from where it stood. For a moment there, time seemed to stand still as we would lock eyes, although my rational mind would tell me this is likely some kind of prank or an optical illusion. Years of experience with the park's wildlife said otherwise. I've never encountered anything like this before. I reached for my radio to call in backup, but noticed that it was emitting nothing but static. The creature then let out a deep and chilling screech, leaping up to about 30 feet into a tall pine and completely vanished. I couldn't believe what I had just seen. My heart raced, adrenaline surging through my veins as a flurry of questions began swirling in my head. What was that? Are there any more of them? Are they dangerous? How could a thing like that exist unseen until now? Well, once I was able to calm myself down, the park ranger's duty took over, and I began quickly gathering evidence of the scene: snapped branches from where it leapt into the tree, tufts of dark reddish-brown hair caught on the bark, and impressions resembling large prints in the soft earth. Much to my disbelief, when backup arrived, we discovered a series of similar footprint impressions that stretched deep into the woods. However, despite our best efforts, no more evidence or sightings were observed on that day, nor any other day since. I reported the sighting and evidence to other park officials, but their conclusion was inconclusive. They suggested it could be an elaborately staged hoax, or perhaps the visitors' imaginations getting the better of them. However, given the frequency and credibility of other Bigfoot sightings in the area, I couldn't completely shake off that day's encounter. Now, what disturbs me the most is when my supervisor pulled me aside afterwards and told me with the most stern expression to drop it. Don't talk about it, just forget about it. Now, obviously this was years ago. I'm now retired from my post as a ranger at Yellowstone, and I still revisit the unexplained events from time to time, wondering what it is that I encountered that day. It was just another ordinary day for me as I worked at Yellowstone National Park as a ranger. My job mostly consisted of maintenance, checking permits, ensuring the safety, that sort of thing. But that all changed on what started as an unremarkable August day, paving the way for an unforgettable experience that defied all rational explanation. For you see, it was mid-afternoon when I received a strange report from a concerned visitor about some unusual noises originating from a remote section of the park. As it was my duty to investigate any such disturbances, I radioed my dispatcher and headed in the direction of the alleged incident. Now, my initial thoughts were that it could have been anything from a troubled animal to a rowdy park visitor, but that perspective quickly changed as I approached. Now, as I neared the location, I noticed that the typical background noise usually filled with bird calls and leaves were eerily quiet. The silence was broken only by the occasional snap of a twig or crunch of leaves beneath my boots. It was unnerving, to say the least, and a sense of unease began to settle in. Now, despite the unsettling atmosphere, I told myself to stay focused and continue forward in search of the source of the disturbance. As I ventured further towards the heart of the park, the terrain became increasingly challenging. With steep slopes and dense undergrowth, I couldn't help but wonder what would cause anyone or anything to venture into such an inhospitable and remote area. Having hiked for miles without encountering a single soul, I grew increasingly uneasy, pondering if I should even continue. Dutifully, I pressed onward. Now, eventually, the forest began to open up more and more, and I found myself standing in front of a small meadow. It was here where the mystery deepened, because some of the trees in the meadow were showing evidence of damage and deep scratches. The ground appeared trampled as though a skirmish had taken place. Panic began to set in as I considered the possibility of a dangerous predator being responsible for the mess. As I examined the disturbed area, I began to hear something I could not quite place, a low, guttural rumbling, and it emanated from not just one place, but almost every direction around me. No bear or mountain lion had ever made a sound like that in my experience, and I instinctively reached for my tranquilizer gun at my hip. Already on high alert, I cautiously crept back into the forest, determined to get to the bottom of the strange occurrences. Now, this low noise persisted intermittently as I continued to traverse the dense, shadowy woods. Now, suddenly, I heard a series of thundering footsteps approaching me from behind, so I whirled around just in time to see a quick blur of motion vanish between the trees. Although I couldn't quite get a clear look at the figure, its sheer size and speed sent my heart racing, and I struggled to remain calm. I decided that it was time to call for backup. Existing protocol required me to wait for assistance before, further engaging with potential unknown threats. I radioed my dispatcher, requested that other rangers join me at my location. So while waiting, I carefully retraced my steps back to the meadow, doing my best to stay as quiet and observant as possible. Upon arriving back at the meadow, I was shocked to find the area transformed. It now looked as if a full-fledged battle had occurred. More trees were damaged, the ground was even further trampled than before, and the bizarre growling was still present, though somewhat more subdued. My colleagues soon arrived, and we all stood in awe of the peculiar scene before us. Afraid, but yet curious, we silently navigated the outskirts of the clearing, searching for any clues or signs of the elusive creature. And as we moved, we discovered enormous, ambiguous tracks that were unlike any animal prints we had ever seen. These bizarre tracks eventually led us to a small, hidden cave from which we could hear the growling reverberate. With our tranquilizer guns at the ready, we approached the cave entrance carefully, hoping for a peaceful resolution. We were met, however, with an empty void. The cave seemed to be entirely unoccupied. It was as if the creature had vanished into thin air. Baffled and unnerved, we thoroughly searched the surroundings, but found no further evidence of whatever had caused these disturbances. Now, as the sun began to set, we regrettably decided to abandon our quest for answers, unsure of what we had just encountered. Now, to this day, I am still unable to find a logical explanation for the events that transpired in that part of Yellowstone. The growling, the damage, the enormous tracks, and the lightning-fast entity still very much bother me. I had worked at Yellowstone for a little over 10 years. I've witnessed and experienced some pretty remarkable things, but nothing that I have experienced during my time there has been as baffling as a sighting that I want to tell you about that happened back in spring in 2018. It started like any other day. I began my shift by patrolling the park's roads and checking on a very popular hiking trail. It was my job to make sure that everything was orderly. Now, around midday, I received a radio call from one of my fellow rangers about an unusual sighting near Lamar Valley. This particular valley is known as a hotspot for wildlife activity. Wolf packs stalk their prey while bison roam the grassy plains. It's also quite secluded and offers some of the most spectacular views in all the park. Intrigued by the report, I decided to take a drive down there and investigate for myself. Now, as I approached the valley, I couldn't help but be in awe by the beauty that I was in. The meadow was so green and lush, framed by towering mountains that just seemed to stretch on forever. and I was reminded why I loved this job so much. I parked my patrol vehicle near the valley's overlook so that I could scan the area with my binoculars. My fellow ranger hadn't been specific about what he saw, only mentioning that it was something he couldn't explain. Regardless, I was prepared to encounter rare wildlife sightings or even unusual natural phenomena. As I surveyed the area, everything appeared normal at first. Bison grazing in the distance and a few pronghorns racing through the valley. But then, something caught my attention. A subtle movement near a grouping of trees on the far side of the valley. Focusing my binoculars on it, I couldn't quite make out what it was, but decided it warranted further investigation. So I made my way through the valley, crossing over a small creek, walking along its tree-lined edge. I could feel the anticipation building up as I neared the location where I had spotted the movement. But nothing would have prepared me for what was about to happen. As I cautiously approached the trees, I suddenly heard faint whispers coming from within the woods. The voices were soft and melodic in nature, almost soothing. Yet they sent shivers down my spine because there should have been nobody around in this remote area. Being an experienced ranger, I was confident that I would not be easily startled. But these whispers felt otherworldly and inexplicable. I tried my best to regain focus on my mission, identifying the source of those earlier movements. Amidst those strange whispers, I suddenly caught sight of a huge figure lurking behind one of the trees, about roughly 50 feet away from me. It stood approximately 6 feet tall, long limbs, and what appeared to be short, white fur covering its body. Now, this figure seemed to be watching me very intently, making no sound and showing no signs of aggression at all. I felt a mixture of confusion and curiosity and began to take several steps towards it as I'm trying to figure out what it is, trying to discern exactly what the creature was while trying to maintain a somewhat safe distance. But the closer I got, the whispers around me grew louder, now echoing all around me. And this paralyzing sensation washed over my entire body. Everything about this situation felt surreal beyond any logical explanation. The creature, still studying me with its unseen gaze, suddenly began to move in a swift, fluid motion and vanished into the forest before I could even properly react. The whispers abruptly ceased along with its disappearance, leaving this horrific silence in the air. And I stood there for moments, collecting my thought, grasping at any reasonable explanation that would somehow make sense of what had just transpired. With no concrete evidence or plausible conclusion, all I could do was report my experience to my supervisor and document it as an unexplained event. Now, over time, I've shared the encounter with some of my fellow rangers and a few trusted visitors. Some speculate that it was an undiscovered species. Others have suggested it could have been a spirit or a visitor from another realm. The park itself is full of legends, history, and folklore, so perhaps these stories hold more truth than most would care to admit. Now, it's been years since then, but this is a story that will always stay with me, especially since no answers or explanations have come to light since this event. My primary responsibility as a ranger at Yellowstone was to ensure the safety of all park personnel and visitors and wildlife. The morning began as usual. I had a few routine patrols, checking for any signs of trouble or potential hazards. It was a perfect day, the kind of day that would make you appreciate your job. I took in everything all the time and savored where I worked. Now, it was around noon, and I decided to take a break near one of the park's popular picnic areas. So as I sat on a bench, eating my lunch and watching multiple families enjoying their time together, I couldn't help but feel a sense of contentment. After finishing my meal, I thought it would be best to stretch my legs and take a short walk through the nearby woods. So I strolled along the well-trodden path, and even noticed a group of children playing near a small creek. They were laughing and splashing in the water, clearly having a great time. So I smiled to myself, happy to see them enjoying nature and creating memories that would last a lifetime. As I continued my walk, I came across an elderly couple sitting on a bench, admiring the view of the distant mountains. We exchanged pleasantries, and they told me about their annual tradition of visiting Yellowstone to celebrate their anniversary. Their love for each other and the park was evident, and I felt honored. After wishing them well, I continued on my way, feeling grateful for the opportunity to witness such wonderful moments. And as I ventured deeper, I noticed that the sounds of laughter and conversation had now faded away, replaced by the calming sounds of leaves and birds. And then I heard a noise that had caught my attention. It was a strange noise that seemed to be coming from somewhere nearby. So I stopped in my tracks and tried my best to pinpoint the source of the sound. Now, my initial thought was that it was a bear, so I was cautiously scanning the area for any movement. And as I stood there, this strange noise that I couldn't quite identify continued crescendoing louder and louder and also growing in intensity. It didn't sound like anything that I could properly identify. And this made me extremely curious, and despite my growing apprehension, I had to investigate further. So I began following the sound, moving slowly and carefully through the very dense thicket. The growling seemed to be coming from a small clearing up ahead, and as I approached, I noticed something odd. Everything around me kind of had this strange mist, almost. It's as if the atmosphere became less visible, if that's making any sense. So now I'm beginning to feel extremely nervous, and I'm now met with a sight that I can't fully explain, because there, standing on two legs, was a massive creature covered in thick fur. I mean, we're talking at least 8 to 9 feet tall, arms that reach down to its knees, its eyes an eerie shade of green. And it continued to emit this strange noise. It sounded like a cross between a gurgle and a growl, but also a screech or like someone scraping on metal. Now I stood there frozen in shock as this thing stared me down and began moving towards me. I could sense power emanating from it, and I knew that I was no match for taking on whatever this was. Then it suddenly veered, taking a sharp 90-degree turn and going off into the tree line, leaving me standing there shaking. So I took the opportunity, running my way back as fast and as hard as I could to the picnic area, my mind racing with 1,001 questions. I decided to report this sighting, and my supervisor fortunately listened as I recounted my experience. He acted just as baffled as I was, suggesting we keep it under wraps to avoid panic. Now, over the following weeks, that memory and the experience continued to haunt me, so I spent countless hours researching any possible explanation I could find. This is what really stemmed my belief in Bigfoot and the unknown. Although it didn't look like a Bigfoot, it was covered in scales and was very reptilian looking, but I don't think it was a giant lizard, if you catch my drift. And then I began to question other things like my own sanity. Had I just imagined the whole thing or hallucinated it? Was I maybe tired, dehydrated? I can't think of any other excuses. Was it maybe a trick of the light or maybe an elaborate hoax? Now, despite all my doubts, I still could not shake the feeling that what I had witnessed was very real. I became very determined to find answers. So I began reaching out to other rangers and asking if they had heard or seen of anything similar. Now, to my surprise, a good friend of mine who's also a ranger pulled me aside and began sharing with me some of the most horrific encounter stories you could ever imagine. And not just by him, but other rangers he had known throughout the years as well. And it was one of those things he explained that you just don't mention it, don't talk about it, and everything will be fine. So, yeah, that's my story, and even now, it's been completely unforgettable.